Sometimes the people we fear most are simply carrying pain we can't see. Sometimes the hearts we judge as cruel are the very ones that understand kindness best. In the dusty town of Ash Ridge, everyone crosses the street when Clint Marlowe walks by. They call him the cruel cowboy after a saloon fight left men broken. But when the new school teacher follows a child's voice to an old stable, she finds Clint on his knees, gently teaching 3 forgotten children to read. His scarred hands trace letters in the dirt, while his voice whispers encouragement. This isn't the monster the town fears. What really happened that night in the saloon? And why does the most avoided man in town spend his evenings giving hope to children no one else notices? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Ash Ridge in shades of amber and dust, casting long shadows between the weathered buildings that lined Main Street. Miss Eleanor Gray stood at her boarding house window, watching the town come alive with the slow, deliberate rhythm of frontier life. 3 months had passed since she'd stepped off the westbound stage, with nothing but 2 carpetbags, a teaching certificate from Boston, and a heart full of hope that distance might heal old wounds. The certificate hung framed on her bedroom wall now, its formal script, a stark reminder of how far she'd traveled not just in miles, but in purpose. Back east, she'd been Miss Gray of the prestigious Beacon Hill Academy, where young ladies learned French and watercolors. Here in Ash Ridge, she was simply the schoolma'am, trying to coax ranch children into understanding arithmetic while their fathers counted cattle and their mothers worried about drought. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house creaked beneath her feet as she made her way downstairs for breakfast. The elderly proprietress bustled about the kitchen, her graying hair pinned severely back, her movements efficient despite her 70-odd years. "Coffee's ready, dear," Mrs. Henderson called without turning from the stove, "though I suspect you'll be needing something stronger after yesterday's council meeting." Ellie winced at the memory. The town council had made it abundantly clear that her suggestions for expanding education to include the poorer children were unwelcome. The Pemberton and Morrison children pay good money for proper instruction. Councilman Webb had declared, his jowls quivering with indignation. "We didn't hire you to waste time on riffraff." "They're children, Mrs. Henderson," Ellie murmured, accepting the steaming cup. "All children deserve to learn." The older woman's expression softened. "You've got a good heart, but this town has its ways, been set in them since before you were born." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Speaking of which, you'd best be careful walking about at odd hours. Folks are starting to talk about your evening constitutionals." Ellie's cheeks warmed. She'd taken to walking the outskirts of town after supper, partly for the exercise, but mostly to escape the suffocating sameness of her small room. The vast Montana sky and endless grasslands reminded her that there was still beauty in the world, even when human hearts seemed determined to close themselves off from it. "What do they say?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "Oh, the usual nonsense, that a proper lady shouldn't wander about unescorted, that you're peculiar." Mrs. Henderson waved a dismissive hand. "Don't pay them any mind. Half this town wouldn't recognize propriety if it bit them on their well. Never mind that." The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted their conversation. Through the lace curtains, Ellie caught sight of Sheriff Watson climbing the steps, his weathered face grim beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Morning, ladies," he said as Mrs. Henderson opened the door. "Miss Gray, I was hoping to have a word." Sheriff Watson was a decent man, perhaps 50 years old, with silver threading through his dark beard and eyes that had seen too much of frontier justice. He'd been kind to Ellie since her arrival, ensuring she felt safe in her new home. "Of course, Sheriff. Please come in." He removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something. There's been talk, nothing serious, mind you, but talk nonetheless about you being out and about in the evenings." "I fail to see how my evening walks are anyone's concern but my own," Ellie replied, though her voice lacked the conviction she'd intended. "Normally, I'd agree with you," Watson said carefully, "but this town's been on edge lately, and when folks get nervous, they start seeing threats where there might not be any. Best to be cautious, is all I'm saying. Ellie set down her coffee cup, with more force than necessary. Threats? I'm a schoolteacher taking walks, not a desperado. I know that, and you know that. But there's been strange doings, reported sounds coming from the old livery stable, footprints where they shouldn't be. People are jumpy. He paused, then added quietly, especially with Marlowe still in town. The name hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Clint Marlowe'th, cruel cowboy, as the children whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. In 3 months, Ellie had seen him perhaps a dozen times, always from a distance. He was impossible to miss, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. When he came to town for supplies, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men stepped aside, some from fear, others from disgust. What exactly did he do? Ellie found herself asking, though she'd posed the question before to various townspeople and never received a satisfactory answer. Sheriff Watson's jaw tightened. Enough. Trust me on that, Miss Gray. Clint Marlowe is not a man you want to encounter alone, especially not in the dark. After the sheriff left, Ellie found herself unable to concentrate on her morning preparations. She'd heard fragments of the story. Of course, something about a saloon fight that had left 2 men badly injured and 1 nearly dead. The details varied depending on who told the tale. Some said Marlowe had been drinking and picked a fight for no reason. Others whispered about cheating at cards or an insult to his character. The only consistent element was the outcome: blood on the saloon floor and a man's reputation destroyed. Yet something about the story had always struck her as incomplete. In her experience, tales that grew in the telling often lost their connection to truth along the way. The walk to the schoolhouse took her down Main Street, past the general store where Mr. Carver kept a ledger of town gossip disguised as a customer log, past the saloon where the infamous fight had occurred, past the church where Reverend Mills preached about Christian charity while pointedly avoiding any mention of forgiveness for certain residents. The school itself was a modest building, white-painted boards and a bell tower that had seen better days. Inside, 12 wooden desks sat in neat rows, each occupied by the sons and daughters of Ash Ridge's more prosperous families. The Pemberton twins, whose father owned the largest ranch in the county. Young Marcus Morrison, the doctor's boy. Sarah Jane Webb, the councilman's precocious daughter who could recite poetry but couldn't add fractions. As Ellie arranged her lessons for the day, her mind wandered to the children she didn't see in these seats. Tommy Briggs, the 10-year-old who swept the saloon for pennies and slept in whatever warm corner he could find. The Martinez children, whose father worked the Pemberton ranch but couldn't afford to spare his youngsters from helping with the family's survival. Little Ben Crawford, whose mother took in washing and whose father had died in a mining accident 2 years prior. These children haunted her thoughts during every lesson, every recitation, every moment she spent teaching the fundamentals of education to those who took it for granted. She'd tried to bring up the possibility of evening classes for working children, but the response had been swift and decisive. The school was for paying students only. "Miss Gray?" Sarah Jane Webb's voice pulled her back to the present. "You look sad." Ellie smiled, smoothing her dark blue dress and adjusting the cameo brooch at her Throata gift from her mother that had travelled west with her, despite everything that had happened. "Just thinking, dear. Now, who can tell me what 7 times 8 equals?" The day passed in its usual rhythm of lessons and small revelations. Marcus Morrison showed remarkable aptitude for geography, while the Pemberton twins struggled with anything that required sitting still. During the lunch break, Ellie stood in the doorway and watched her students play in the schoolyard, their laughter carrying on the autumn breeze. It was then she saw him. Clint Marlowe rode slowly down Main Street on a black horse that seemed to match his somber presence. Even from a distance, she could see the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he kept his eyes straight ahead, acknowledging no one. As he passed the schoolyard, several of her students stopped their games to stare. The Pemberton twins clutched each other dramatically, having obviously been raised on stories of the cruel cowboys' terrible deeds. But Ellie found herself studying the man rather than the legend. There was something in his posture that spoke of weariness rather than menace, of loneliness rather than cruelty. When a stray dog ran into the street ahead of his horse, Marlowe reined in gently, waiting patiently for the animal to move aside, rather than spurring his mount forward, as many men might have done. It was a small thing, hardly worth noting, yet it lodged itself in her mind like a splinter. That evening, despite Sheriff Watson's warnings and Mrs. Henderson's concerned looks, Ellie set out for her usual walk. The town had settled into its nightly quiet, windows glowing yellow with lamplight, the distant sound of the saloon's piano drifting on the cool air. She walked past the last houses, past the cemetery with its weathered headstones, until she reached the open grassland that stretched toward the mountains. Here, beneath the vast canopy of stars, she could breathe freely. Here, the weight of expectations and propriety lifted from her shoulders like morning mist. She'd grown up under the watchful eyes of Boston society, where every word and gesture was measured against an impossible standard of feminine perfection. The freedom of the frontier had been one of the few blessings of her westward journey. She was walking back toward town when she heard the voices. At first, she thought it might be cowhands from one of the ranches, perhaps sharing a bottle and stories around a campfire. But as she drew closer to the old livery stabler building that had been abandoned since the new one was built closer to the train, DePoche realized the voices were different, softer, younger, and underneath them, a deeper voice, patient and encouraging. "That's right, Tommy," sounded out. C-A-T, cat. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She knew that voice, though she'd never heard it speak so gently. Moving carefully in the darkness, she approached the stable's side wall, where gaps between the weathered boards provided glimpses of the interior. What she saw there would change everything she thought she knew about Ash Ridge, about justice, and about the man the town called cruel. Clint Marlowe knelt in the hay-strewn floor of the stable, a battered book open in his large hands. Around him sat 3 children, Tommy Briggs, whose clothes were too small and whose eyes held too much knowledge of hardship, a girl Ellie didn't recognize, perhaps 12 years old, with tangled brown hair and a dress that had seen better seasons, and young Ben Crawford, the washing woman's son, his face bright with concentration in the lamplight. "Very good," Marlowe was saying, his voice devoid of the harsh edge she'd expected. "Now, Ben, you try the next word." The scene was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she'd been told about this man, that Ellie wondered if she might be dreaming. But the cool night air on her skin and the sound of patient instruction continued, proof that her eyes weren't deceiving her. Clint Marlowe feared, the avoided, the cruel cowboy of Ash Ridge was, teaching children to read. Ellie backed away from the stable as quietly as she'd approached, her heart pounding with the weight of discovery. She walked home in a daze. Mrs. Henderson's questions about her pale complexion answered with vague murmurs about the evening air. That night, sleep eluded her completely. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while questions churned in her mind like storm clouds. How long had this been going on? How had no one else discovered it? And most importantly, what kind of man risks his already damaged reputation to help forgotten children learn to read? By morning, Ellie had reached a decision that would set in motion events neither she nor Clint Marlowe could have foreseen. She would find a way to help, even if it meant challenging everything the town of Ash Ridge believed about its most feared resident. After all, she'd come west to escape her past and build something new. Perhaps this was exactly the purpose she'd been searching for. 2 days after her shocking discovery, Ellie stood before her classroom, trying to focus on the morning's arithmetic lesson, while her mind remained fixed on the image of Clint Marlowe kneeling in lamplight, patiently guiding small fingers across the pages of a worn book. The contradiction between the town's fearsome stories and what she'd witnessed gnawed at her like a persistent ache. "Miss Gray?" Marcus Morrison's voice cut through her distraction. "You've been staring at the blackboard for quite some time." Heat rose in her cheeks as she turned to face her students, 12 pairs of eyes regarding her with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. "My apologies, children. I was considering how best to explain today's lesson." The day dragged with unusual weight, each hour seeming to stretch like taffy in summer heat. During recess, she found herself watching Tommy Briggs through the window as he swept the front steps of Carver's General Store, his thin shoulders bent to the task. The boy should have been in school, learning his letters alongside the other children, but instead he worked for coins that barely kept him fed. When the final bell rang and her students scattered toward their comfortable homes, Ellie remained at her desk, staring at Tommy's torn primurth, very book that had led her to make a terrible mistake the evening before. She'd been walking her usual route when she spotted the boy heading away from town just as darkness began to settle. Concerned that he might be lost or in some kind of trouble, she'd followed at a distance. The pursuit had led her to the abandoned livery stable, where the sound of voices had drawn her closer. What she'd discovered there had shaken her understanding of everything she thought she knew about Ash Ridge and its most reviled resident. Now, as she sat in the empty schoolhouse, Ellie made a decision that would change both their lives forever. That evening, she waited until full darkness had settled over the town before making her way toward the old stable. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the weathered building, where yellow lamplight leaked between the wooden boards like liquid gold. The voices inside were clearer tonight: Clint's deep baritone, offering gentle corrections, Tommy's eager responses, and the soft murmurs of the other children. "The word is horse, not house," came Clint's patient voice. "See how the changes the sound?" "Horse," Tommy repeated carefully. "Like your black one, Mr. Marlowe." "That's right. Thunder's a horse, though sometimes I think he believes he's a king." The children's laughter drifted through the night air, a sound so natural and joyful that it made Ellie's chest tighten with emotion. Here, in this abandoned stable, something beautiful was happening, something the town would condemn if they discovered it. Moving carefully to avoid detection, Ellie positioned herself where she could observe through a gap in the boards. The scene inside was even more remarkable than her first glimpse had suggested. Clint sat on an overturned crate, the lamp beside him casting warm light across his scarred face. The harsh lines she'd always associated with his appearance seemed softer here, gentled by concentration and genuine care. 3 children surrounded him. Tommy with his eager questions, the girl she now recognized as Sarah Whitmana Runaway, who'd been living rough for months, and little Ben Crawford, whose mother worked her fingers raw to keep them both fed. Each child held a book, though the volumes were clearly well worn and carefully treasured. "Miss Sarah, would you like to try reading the next part?" Clint asked, his voice carrying none of the gruffness townspeople associated with him. The girl looked up with bright eyes. "Out loud? If you're comfortable with it, remember there's no shame in taking your time." As Sarah began to sound out the words on her page, stumbling occasionally but pressing forward with determination, Ellie found herself leaning closer to hear better. The board she was pressed against groaned softly under her weight. The reading stopped abruptly. "What was that?" Tommy whispered, his voice tight with fear. Clint rose slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "Stay where you are, children. It's probably just the wind." Ellie's blood turned to ice as she heard his footsteps approaching the wall where she hid. In moments, he would round the corner and discover her spying on their secret gathering. The thought of his reaction, likely anger, possibly violence given his reputation, made her consider fleeing into the darkness. Instead, she found herself stepping into the lamplight as he emerged from the stable. "Mr. Marlowe," she said quietly, raising her hands to show she carried no weapon. "Please don't be alarmed." He froze at the sight of her, his hand still resting on his gun butt. In the yellow glow spilling from the stable doorway, his scarred face was a mask of wariness, and something that might have been fear, though, whether for himself or the children, she couldn't tell. Miss Grey. His voice had lost all the gentleness she'd heard moments before, returning to the clipped, guarded tone she associated with his rare appearances in town. "You shouldn't be here." "I followed Tommy," she said, which was true enough. "I was concerned when I saw him heading this way after dark." Behind Clint, she could see the three children huddled together just inside the stable entrance, their faces pale with worry. Tommy looked particularly stricken, as if he'd somehow betrayed the man who'd been teaching him. "The boy's in no danger," Clint said flatly. "You can head back to town with a clear conscience." But Ellie didn't move. Instead, she found herself studying his face in the lamplight, searching for signs of the monster the town believed him to be. What she saw instead was a man braced for condemnation, his jaw tight with the expectation of judgment. "What you're doing," she said slowly, "it's wonderful." The words seemed to hit him like a physical blow. His hand dropped from his gun, and for a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. "It's not what you think," he said roughly. "I'm not who they needed help, that's all. Someone to teach them letters." "That's exactly what I think it is," Ellie replied, taking a cautious step closer. "You're teaching children to read, children the town has forgotten." "Miss Grey?" Tommy's voice piped up from behind Clint. "Are you going to tell on us?" The question hung in the night air like a challenge. Ellie looked at the three young faces peering out from the stable, each marked by hardship, but bright with hope in this hidden sanctuary. Then she looked at Clint, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since her arrival in Ash Ridge. This was no cruel cowboy terrorizing innocents. This was a man using his own time and resources to provide education to children who had no other opportunity. The contrast between his reputation and his reality was so stark it made her question everything else she'd been told about him. "No," she said firmly, "I'm not going to tell anyone." Relief flickered across Clint's features before the mask of wariness returned. "That's appreciated, but it doesn't change anything. This needs to remain quiet." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "What you're doing is admirable, Mr. Marlowe. Why hide it?" His laugh was bitter, devoid of humor. "Look around you, Miss Grey. We're meeting in an abandoned stable after dark because no respectable establishment would welcome me, let alone allow me to teach their children. The town barely tolerates my presence as it is. But surely if people knew you were helping, they'd assume I had some twisted purpose." He cut her off. "That's what they think of me, what they'll always think." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and it stirred something protective in Ellie's chest. She'd arrived in Ash Ridge carrying her own burden of judgment and whispered accusations. The parallels weren't lost on her. "What if there was another way?" she found herself saying. "What if someone else could help?" Clint's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm a trained teacher, Mr. Marlowe. I have access to books, supplies, proper lesson plans." She paused, then added quietly, "And I know what it's like to be judged unfairly by people who don't know the whole story." For several long moments, they stood in silence, the night air cooling around them, while three children waited to learn whether their secret sanctuary would survive this unexpected discovery. Finally, Clint spoke. "Why would you risk your reputation for this? For them?" He gestured toward the children. "For me?" Ellie considered the question, thinking of all the reasons that had brought her to this moment. Her frustration with the town's rigid social hierarchy, her heartbreak over the children denied education, her growing certainty that the man before her was nothing like the monster people believed him to be. "Because it's right," she said simply, "and because everyone deserves a chance to learn." Something shifted in Clint's expression, surprise, perhaps, or the beginning of hope. Behind him, Tommy stepped forward into the lamplight. "Does this mean Miss Grey can help us with the hard words?" the boy asked eagerly. "She knows everything about reading." Despite the gravity of the moment, Ellie found herself smiling. "I'd like to try, if Mr. Marlowe is willing to accept my assistance." Clint studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether her offer came from genuine concern or some hidden agenda. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he finally nodded. "The children come first," he said quietly. "Whatever else happens, they come first." "Agreed," Ellie replied without hesitation. And so, in the flickering lamplight of an abandoned stable, an unlikely partnership was born that would challenge everything Ash Ridge believed about justice, redemption, and the power of education to transform lives. As Ellie walked home through the quiet streets, her mind raced with possibilities and concerns. She was now part of something that could destroy her carefully rebuilt life if discovered, yet she'd never felt more certain of a decision. Tomorrow, she would begin planning how to better serve the forgotten children of Ash Ridge. Tonight, however, she carried the image of Clint Marlowe's scarred hands gently turning pages for eager young minds, and the growing certainty that she'd finally found the purpose that had eluded her since leaving Boston. The cruel cowboy, it seemed, was the kindest man in town. For 3 days following her discovery at the stable, Ellie moved through her daily routine with the careful deliberation of someone harboring a precious secret. She taught her regular students with renewed purpose, knowing that when evening came, she would have the opportunity to extend that same gift to children who desperately needed it. The challenge lay in how to proceed without drawing unwanted attention. During her lunch break on the 3rd day, she made her way to Carver's general store under the pretense of purchasing supplies for her classroom. The store was a maze of shelves, packed with everything from farming tools to bolt fabric, and somewhere among the merchandise, she hoped to find what she needed. Mr. Carver, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an unfortunate tendency toward gossip, looked up from his account ledger as she entered. "Afternoon, Miss Gray. What brings you by today?" "I'm looking for books," she said, keeping her voice casual. "Primers, specifically. Something suitable for beginning readers." His eyebrows rose with interest. "Planning to expand your curriculum? The council's finally coming around to your ideas about additional students?" "Something like that," Ellie replied, which wasn't entirely a lie. She was hoping to expand education, just not in the way he imagined. Carver led her to a dusty corner where a small selection of books shared space with bolts of calico and packets of seeds. The pickings were slim, a few outdated textbooks, several volumes of sermons, and her heart-leaping, pristine copy of McGuffey's First Eclectic Reader. "This one," she said, running her fingers over the familiar cover. It was the same primer she'd learned from as a child, filled with simple stories and moral lessons designed to teach both reading and character. "Excellent choice. That'll be $2. It was more than she could comfortably afford on her teacher's salary, but Ellie handed over the money without hesitation. As Carver wrapped the book in brown paper, she forced herself to make casual conversation about the weather and the upcoming harvest, all while her mind raced with plans. That evening, she waited until well after dark before slipping out of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. The streets of Ash Ridge were quiet, most residents settled in for the night, which made her journey to the outskirts of town feel both secretive and somehow sacred. Clint Marlowe's homestead sat on a small piece of land, about a mile from the town proper. Ellie had never seen it up close, but she'd heard it described as Modesta cabin, a barn, and a few outbuildings surrounded by grassland where he kept his horses. As she approached in the darkness, she could see lamplight glowing in the cabin's single window. Her courage faltered as she stood at the edge of his property. What exactly was she doing? She barely knew this man beyond their brief encounter at the stable. For all she knew, he might respond to her unexpected visit with suspicion or anger. But the memory of those 3 children reading by lamplight strengthened her resolve. Moving as quietly as possible, she approached the cabin's front porch. The structure was simple but well-maintained, with a roof that showed recent repairs and steps that didn't creak under her weight. She placed the wrapped book on the wooden planks beside the door, then retreated to wait and watch from behind a stand of cottonwood trees. Long minutes passed before the cabin door opened. Clint stepped onto the porch, a rifle in his hands, his head turning as he scanned the darkness for whatever had triggered his awareness. He was dressed simply in dark trousers and a white shirt open at the collar, his scarred face alert but not alarmed. His gaze fell on the package beside his door. Ellie held her breath as he bent to examine it, his movements cautious. Even from a distance, she could see his confusion as he looked around once more before picking up the wrapped book. He turned it over in his hands, clearly puzzled by its unexpected appearance. When he unwrapped it and saw the primer, his reaction was not what she'd expected. Instead of pleasure or gratitude, his expression grew troubled, almost pained. He stood holding the book for several moments, his shoulders tense with some internal struggle. Finally, he went back inside, taking the book with him. Ellie waited another few minutes before making her way back to town, her mind churning with questions. Had she overstepped some boundary? Was he offended by her gesture? The uncertainty gnawed at her as she slipped back into the boarding house and up to her room. The next morning brought no answers. During her usual errands, she saw no sign of Clint in town, which wasn't unusual but left her wondering about his reaction to her gift. She caught herself watching the road that led to his homestead, hoping for some glimpse of him that might provide a clue to his thoughts. It wasn't until the following evening that she received her answer. She was grading papers by lamplight when Mrs. Henderson called up the stairs that she had a visitor. Ellie's heart jumped. Few people came calling at such an hour, and even fewer would ask for her specifically. She found Tommy Briggs waiting in the boarding house parlor, his thin frame nearly swallowed by the overstuffed chair where he perched. His clothes were cleaner than usual, and someone had made an attempt to tame his unruly hair. "Tommy," she said, genuinely surprised, "what brings you here?" The boy reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "Mr. Marlowe asked me to give you this, Miss Gray. He said to tell you it was important." Ellie accepted the note with hands that trembled slightly. The paper was good quality, and her name was written across it in a careful, masculine script that spoke of education, despite its deliberate restraint. "Thank you, Tommy. Would you like some milk and cookies before you head back?" The boy's eyes lit up, but he shook his head. "Mr. Marlowe's waiting for me. We're doing numbers tonight, and I don't want to be late." After Tommy left, Ellie retreated to her room before unfolding the note. The message was brief, but carried weight in every carefully chosen word. "Miss Gray, your gift was unexpected and generous. I am not accustomed to kindness from the people of this town, and I confess I am uncertain of your motives. However, the children benefit from proper materials, and for their sake, I am grateful. If you are sincere in your offer of assistance, there are conditions that must be understood. The children's safety and well-being come before all other considerations. What we do must remain secret, for their protection as much as mine, and you must understand that association with me will bring you nothing but trouble if discovered. Should you wish to proceed despite these warnings, you may find us at the stable tomorrow evening after full dark. Bring whatever educational materials you think appropriate, but bring them quietly. I hope you understand the gravity of what you propose to undertake. C. Marlowe." Ellie read the note 3 times, studying not just the words but the careful penmanship that revealed an educated hand despite the man's rough reputation. There was dignity in the formal tone and a protectiveness toward the children that spoke well of his character. More importantly, there was an invitation. She spent the rest of the evening planning what materials to bring and how to transport them without drawing attention. From her personal collection, she selected several primers, a slate and chalk, some paper, and pencils. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The following day seemed to drag endlessly. She found herself watching the clock during lessons, counting the hours until evening. Her students noticed her distraction. Marcus Morrison commented that she seemed especially thoughtful during their geography lesson, but she managed to maintain the facade of normalcy until the final bell rang. That evening, she bundled her selected materials into a canvas bag and made her way through the quiet streets toward the old stable. The autumn air carried a bite that promised winter's approach, and overhead, stars scattered across the vast Montana sky like scattered diamonds. As she approached the stable, she could see the familiar glow of lamplight through the gaps in the boards. Voices drifted on the night air, Clint's patient instruction, and the children's eager responses. The sound filled her with anticipation and a surprising sense of homecoming. She paused at the stable entrance, suddenly uncertain. What if she was intruding on something that didn't need her help? What if her presence changed the dynamic that seemed to work so well? Before her doubts could take hold, Tommy's voice called out, "Miss Gray, you came." Clint rose from where he'd been sitting with the children, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. The children, Tommy, Sarah, and Ben, looked at her with eager faces, their books clutched in small hands. "Mr. Marlowe," she said formally, then added with a smile, "I brought supplies." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes that suggested approval. "The children have been asking about you since yesterday. They're curious about proper teaching methods." As she set down her bag and began unpacking the materials, Ellie felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she belonged, not in the sterile environment of the regular schoolhouse, but here, in this humble stable, working with children who truly hungered for knowledge. "Shall we begin?" she asked, and was rewarded with 3 enthusiastic nods and something that might have been gratitude in Clint Marlowe's scarred face. The first lesson of their unlikely partnership was about to begin. The note appeared on Ellie's windowsill on a Tuesday morning, tucked beneath a smooth river stone to keep the autumn wind from carrying it away. She discovered it while preparing for the day's lessons, her heart skipping as she recognized the careful handwriting that had become familiar over the past week. "Would you like more books?" 4 simple words, but they represented something precious, the first direct communication from Clint since their partnership had begun. During their evening sessions at the stable, he remained polite but distant, focusing entirely on the children's education while maintaining an invisible barrier between himself and Ellie. She understood his caution. The man had been living with the town's condemnation for so long that trust didn't come easily. But the note suggested he was beginning to see her as something more than a temporary curiosity or potential threat. Ellie retrieved her pen and wrote her response on the back of his paper. Yes. What subjects would be most helpful? That evening, she left her reply tucked under the same stone where his note had been. By morning, it was gone, replaced by a longer message that revealed more than perhaps he'd intended. The children struggle most with arithmetic and geography. Tommy asks questions about places beyond Ashridgehay, dreams of traveling to see the ocean. Sarah wants to understand how money works, probably because she's never had enough of it. Ben is fascinated by animals and asks about creatures he's never seen. I do what I can, but my own education has gaps. A proper teacher's guidance would benefit them greatly. There is a hollow oak about 50 yards behind the stable. If you prefer to leave materials there rather than risk being seen at my homestead, I will understand. Reading between the careful lines, Ellie detected not just practical concerns, but something deeper, a man genuinely worried about the children's futures and humble enough to acknowledge his limitations. It was far from the image of arrogant cruelty the town had painted. Over the following days, she began collecting materials with more purpose. From her personal library, she selected a geography book filled with illustrations of distant lands and creatures. She purchased an arithmetic primer with her own funds, along with a small globe that had caught her eye in Carver's store. Each evening, she left something new in the hollow oak, and each morning found it replaced by brief notes of gratitude and reports on the children's progress. Sarah spent an hour studying the world map. She can now point to Boston and understands why you came so far west. Ben carried the animal book everywhere yesterday. He's decided he wants to become a veterinarian when he grows up. Tommy asked if the ocean really has no other shore you can see. I told him you would know better than I. The notes revealed a man paying careful attention to 3 young minds, nurturing their curiosity and dreams with patience and genuine care. Ellie found herself looking forward to these written exchanges almost as much as the evening lessons themselves. It was during their second week of collaboration that everything changed. Ellie had been walking to the stable as usual when she noticed someone else approaching from a different direction. Her blood chilled as she recognized Sheriff Watson's distinctive silhouette moving through the darkness. Had someone discovered their secret? Were they about to be arrested for what? Teaching children to read? She pressed herself against the side of a nearby shed, watching as the sheriff drew closer to the stable. Inside, she could hear Clint's voice, helping Ben sound out a difficult word. In moments, Watson would hear it too. Without thinking, Ellie stepped into the sheriff's path. "Sheriff Watson," she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "What brings you out so late?" He startled, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun before recognizing her. "Miss Gray, you gave me quite a start. What are you doing out here?" "I was walking," she said, which was true enough. "The night air helps me think." "Well, you might want to head back toward town. I've had reports of suspicious activity in this area lights where there shouldn't be any voices carrying on the night air. Could be drifters looking for trouble." Behind the sheriff, the stable had fallen silent. Clint had obviously heard their conversation and was keeping the children quiet. "I haven't seen anything unusual," Ellie said carefully. "Perhaps it was just settlers passing through." Watson frowned, clearly torn between investigating further and escorting her safely back to town. His protective instincts toward the respectable schoolteacher won out. "Let me walk you back," he said. "These old buildings aren't safe after dark, especially for a lady alone." As they walked toward town, Ellie's mind raced. Who had reported the activity? How much did they know? And most importantly, how could she warn Clint without arousing further suspicion? The answer came to her as she lay sleepless that night. The next morning, she left a different kind of note in the hollow oak. "Someone has been watching. Sheriff came last night asking about lights and voices. We need to be more careful." When she checked the tree that evening, she found a response that made her chest tight with anxiety. "Understood. No more meetings until it's safe. Thank you for the warning. The children will miss their lessons." For 3 days, the stable remained dark and silent. Ellie continued her evening walks, partly to maintain her routine and partly in hope of seeing some sign that the children were safe. On the 4th night, she found a longer note waiting. "The risk is too great to continue as we have been. I've thought of little else for days, but the children need what we can give them. If you're willing to take a greater chance, there may be another way. I could bring materials to them, individually visit their homes, or find other meeting places. It would be less efficient, but safer. However, this would require your continued help with supplies, and perhaps your direct involvement in teaching. I know this asks much of you. Your reputation, your position, everything could be lost if we're discovered. I would understand if you prefer to end this arrangement now, but if you're willing to continue, leave a book in the oak tomorrow night. I'll know you've decided to trust me despite the risks. CM. Ellie read the note 3 times, weighing the implications of what he was asking. Individual meetings would indeed be riskier, more opportunities for discovery, more chances for someone to ask uncomfortable questions. And yet, the thought of abandoning Tommy, Sarah, and Ben to their previous hopelessness was unbearable. The next evening, she placed not just 1 book, but 3 in the hollow oak, along with a note of her own. "The children's education is worth any risk. How do we proceed?" His response came swiftly. "Meet me tomorrow at sunset behind the church. Come alone and bring whatever materials you think most important. We'll discuss how to help each child individually. Thank you for your courage." The following evening found Ellie standing in the shadow of Ash Ridge's modest church, a bag of teaching supplies at her feet and her heart beating fast with nervous anticipation. The setting sun painted the grassland in shades of gold and amber, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called to its mate. She heard him before she saw him, the soft sound of boots on grass and the gentle murmur of his voice speaking to his horse. When Clint emerged from behind the church's rear corner, leading Thunder by the reins, she was struck again by the contrast between his fearsome reputation and his careful, almost gentle demeanor. "Miss Gray," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat. "I wasn't certain you'd come." "I gave you my word," she replied. "How do we help them?" For the first time since she'd known him, Clint almost smiled. "One child at a time," he said, and very, very carefully. As they stood together in the fading light, making plans to continue their secret education of Ash Ridge's forgotten children, Ellie realized that somewhere along the way, her feelings about Clint Marlowe had undergone a profound transformation. The cruel cowboy had become simply Clinterman, dedicated to nurturing young minds despite the personal cost. It was a dangerous realization in more ways than one. The makeshift classroom took shape gradually over the course of 2 weeks, born from necessity and built with hope. What had begun as an abandoned stable had transformed into something that resembled a proper learning environment, though one that could be dismantled and hidden at a moment's notice. Clint had arranged wooden crates to serve as desks, their surfaces smoothed with sandpaper and positioned to catch the lamplight most effectively. Old horse blankets provided cushioning for the children to sit on, and a larger crate served as Ellie's teaching station. It wasn't elegant, but it was functional, and more importantly, it was theirs. "It's like having a real school," Sarah whispered on their first evening back together, running her fingers across the surface of her makeshift desk. "Only better, because nobody can tell us we don't belong here." The girl's words struck Ellie with unexpected force. In all her years of formal education, she'd never heard such appreciation for the simple act of learning. These children understood the value of what they were receiving, in a way her regular students never could. "Before we begin tonight's lesson," Ellie said, settling onto her own crate, "I'd like to establish some rules for our classroom." Tommy raised his hand with the seriousness of a seasoned scholar. "Yes, Miss Gray?" "First, this is a place where everyone's questions are welcome. There's no such thing as a foolish question when you're trying to learn." Ben's face lit up. "Even about animals?" "Especially about animals," Ellie confirmed, earning a grin from the boy. "Second, we help each other. If someone is struggling with a word or concept, we work together to understand it." "Like a real family," Sarah said quietly. "Exactly like a family," Ellie agreed. And third, she glanced at Clint, who had been listening from his position near the stable entrance, ever watchful for signs of trouble. "We respect each other and our teachers." It was a small thing, referring to Clint as one of their teachers, but she saw how it affected him. His shoulders straightened slightly, and something that might have been pride flickered across his scarred features. "Mr. Marlowe has been teaching you far longer than I have," Ellie continued. "He understands things about life and survival that books can't always convey. We're fortunate to learn from both of you." The evening's lesson focused on geography, with the children taking turns finding locations on the small globe Ellie had purchased. Tommy's questions about the ocean led to a discussion of trade routes and distant ports. Sarah wanted to know about cities where a person could disappear and start fresh. Ben was fascinated by the idea of places where exotic animals roamed free. As the children absorbed each piece of information with hungry enthusiasm, Ellie found herself watching Clint more than she probably should have. He listened to every word, occasionally asking questions of his own, or offering practical insights that grounded their theoretical discussions in reality. "The mountains between here and California," he said when Tommy asked about traveling west. "They're beautiful but dangerous. A person needs to understand weather patterns, have proper supplies, know how to read the signs of trouble coming." "Have you been there?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Something shuddered in Clint's expression. "Once, long time ago." He didn't elaborate, but Ellie detected pain in those 3 words, the weight of memories he wasn't ready to share. She smoothly redirected the lesson to safer territory, but filed away the information for later consideration. As the weeks passed, their evening routine developed its own rhythm. Clint would arrive first, ensuring the stable was secure and lighting the lamp. The children would appear one by one, careful to approach from different directions to avoid attracting attention. Ellie came last, after full darkness had settled and the town's eyes had turned elsewhere. Each session revealed new facets of both Clint's character and the children's remarkable resilience. Tommy proved to have a gift for arithmetic that amazed even Ellie. Given proper instruction, he could work through problems that challenged students twice his age. Sarah demonstrated an intuitive understanding of language that suggested she might become a writer someday, if given the chance. Ben's curiosity about the natural world was boundless, and he absorbed information about animals and plants with the dedication of a true scholar. But it was watching Clint with the children that truly opened Ellie's eyes to the man behind the fearsome reputation. He had infinite patience for their struggles, never showing frustration when they stumbled over difficult words or concepts. When Tommy confessed he sometimes felt stupid compared to the children who attended regular school, Clint knelt beside the boy's crate and spoke with quiet conviction. "Smart isn't about how fast you learn something," he said. "It's about not giving up when things get hard. You've survived on your own in this town for years, Tommy. That takes more intelligence than most people ever develop." When Sarah had nightmares about her past, she'd been running from something or someone back east. Though she'd never shared the details, Clint would sit with her until the fear passed, his presence a steady anchor in her storm of memories. And when Ben worried that his dreams of becoming a veterinarian were foolish for a boy from his circumstances, Clint shared stories of men he'd known who'd risen from nothing to achieve remarkable things. "Dreams aren't foolish, Ben," he said one evening as they practiced writing animal names. "What's foolish is letting other people convince you to give up on them." It was during one of these quiet moments that Ellie began to see past the walls Clint had built around himself. The gentleness he showed the children wasn't an act or a temporary facade, it was fundamental to who he was, beneath the scars and the reputation. The town had judged him based on a single violent incident, never bothering to look deeper or ask harder questions about what had really happened that night. Their shared lesson plan, written in both their handwritings, hung on a nail driven into one of the stable's support posts. It was a simple schedule: arithmetic on Mondays, geography on Wednesdays, reading practice on Fridays, but it represented something profound, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "You're good with them," Ellie told Clint one evening, as they watched the children pack up their books and prepare to slip back into the night. He looked surprised by the compliment. "They're good kids. They deserve better than what this town offers them." "They deserve teachers who see their potential," she said carefully. "You saw it long before I arrived." Clint was quiet for a moment, his gaze following Tommy as the boy disappeared into the darkness. "I know what it's like to be written off before you've had a real chance. Figured maybe I could keep that from happening to them." The admission revealed more about his past than he'd shared in all their previous conversations combined. Ellie found herself wanting to ask about his own childhood, his education, the experiences that had shaped his understanding of injustice. But the questions felt too personal, too invasive for their still developing friendship. Instead, she said, "What you've built here is remarkable. They trust you completely." "Trust is earned," he replied, "and easily broken. I don't take that responsibility lightly." As autumn deepened toward winter, their secret school faced new challenges. The evenings grew colder, requiring additional blankets and a small brazier for warmth. The shortened days meant less cover of darkness for their movements. Most concerning of all, the children's improved literacy was beginning to show in their daily lives. Tommy was asking more sophisticated questions around town. Sarah had been caught reading a discarded newspaper, and Ben had started using words that raised eyebrows among those who knew his background. "We're too successful," Ellie confided to Clint one evening as they arranged their materials. "People are beginning to notice changes in them." "I've been thinking the same thing," he admitted. "Tommy asked Mr. Carver about the price of train tickets to San Francisco yesterday. When Carver mentioned it to me, he seemed puzzled about where a street boy would learn about such places. What do we do?" Clint was quiet for a long moment, his scarred hands arranging books with careful precision. "We prepare them for whatever comes next. And we hope that when the truth comes out, because it will come out, eventually people will see the good we've done, rather than just the rules we've broken." That night, as Ellie walked home through the quiet streets of Ash Ridge, she found herself thinking about trust and courage, about the risks they were taking, and the reasons that made those risks worthwhile. Somewhere along the way, her feelings about Clint Marlowe had evolved from mere respect to something deeper and more complicated. She was falling in love with a man the town considered irredeemable, and that realization both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. The shared lesson plan had become more than just a schedulite, was a testament to their growing partnership, written in Ellie's careful script and Clint's more angular handwriting. Each addition and modification told the story of their collaboration. Notes about Tommy's mathematical gifts, observations about Sarah's poetic sensibilities, reminders about Ben's fascination with the natural world. We should add penmanship practice, Ellie suggested one evening in late October as they prepared for the children's arrival. Their handwriting is improving, but proper letter formation will serve them well. Clint nodded, watching her add the note to their plan. "You think like a real teacher," he said, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, I know what you meant," Ellie said softly. "Thank you." The compliment hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken feelings that had been building over their weeks of working together. Ellie had tried to ignore the way her heart quickened when Clint arrived each evening, the way she found herself watching the gentle way he handled the children's books, the quiet pride in his voice when one of them mastered a difficult concept. She was a respectable schoolteacher from Boston, and he was a man whose reputation had been destroyed by violence. The gulf between their social positions should have been insurmountable, yet here in their makeshift classroom, such distinctions seemed meaningless. "Miss Gray," Tommy's voice called softly from the stable entrance, interrupting her dangerous thoughts. "Mr. Marlowe, we brought someone new." Ellie's blood chilled. The last thing their secret school needed was additional exposure, another child who might accidentally reveal their activities to the wrong person. But when Tommy stepped into the lamplight, he was followed by a girl Ellie had never seen before, perhaps 8 years old, with dark hair and clothes that had seen better seasons. Behind her came Ben, and bringing up the rear was Sarah, who looked both excited and nervous. "This is Maria," Tommy announced proudly. "Her family's working the Morrison Ranch, but she doesn't speak much English yet. We thought maybe you could teach her." Clint and Ellie exchanged glances. The addition of another student meant greater risk of discovery, but the hope in the child's dark eyes was impossible to ignore. "Maria," Ellie said gently, kneeling to the girl's level. "Hablas español?" The child's face lit up with relief, and she nodded vigorously, launching into rapid Spanish that Ellie's limited knowledge couldn't fully follow. But she caught enough to understand that Maria desperately wanted to learn English, to attend school like the other children, to have the opportunities that seemed so far out of reach. "We can try," Ellie said finally, looking to Clint for confirmation. "But we'll need different materials, different approaches." "I have some Spanish," Clint said quietly. "Picked it up working ranches in Texas years ago. Between the two of us, we might manage." It was another small revelation about his past, another piece of the puzzle that was Clint Marlowe. A man who'd traveled, worked different jobs, accumulated knowledge and experiences that belied the simple narrative of cruelty the town had constructed around him. As they arranged their classroom to accommodate 5 students instead of 3, Ellie found herself stealing glances at Clint. His movements were economical and sure, arranging crates and blankets with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. When he caught her watching, their eyes met for a moment longer than propriety would suggest appropriate. "The children are fortunate to have you," she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "They're fortunate to have both of us," he replied, and something in his tone made her wonder if he felt the same dangerous pull she'd been fighting against. The evening's lesson focused on basic English vocabulary for Maria, while the other children worked on more advanced reading. Watching Clint patiently help the young girl sound out simple words, switching between English and Spanish with natural ease, Ellie felt something shift inside her chest, recognition that this man was nothing like the monster the town believed him to be. He was kind, patient, intelligent, and dedicated to helping children who had nowhere else to turn. More than that, he was gentle in ways that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with strength under control. Miss Gray? Sarah's voice pulled her back to the lesson at hand. You're staring again. Heat flooded Ellie's cheeks as she realized the older girl was right. She'd been watching Clint with Maria instead of focusing on her own students. I was observing teaching techniques, she said, which was partly true. Sarah's knowing smile suggested the girl wasn't entirely convinced, but she returned to her reading without comment. As the weeks progressed, their expanded classroom developed new rhythms. Maria proved to be a quick learner, absorbing English vocabulary with remarkable speed. Tommy had appointed himself her special helper, taking pride in his role as translator and guide. Ben shared his animal books with her, pointing out pictures and teaching her the English names for creatures she recognized from her family's travels. But it was the growing connection between Ellie and Clint that presented the most complicated development. Their partnership had evolved beyond mere collaboration. They anticipated each other's teaching methods, building on each other's lessons with seamless coordination. When Clint struggled to explain a mathematical concept, Ellie would step in with a different approach. When she had difficulty making herself understood to Maria, Clint's Spanish would bridge the gap. More concerning were the moments when their professional relationship seemed to blur into something more personal. The evening when Clint had caught her hand to steady her as she climbed onto a crate, his touch lingering longer than necessary. The night when she'd found him reading her notes about the children's progress with an expression of something that looked like admiration. The way he'd begun saying her nominate, Miss Gray, with formal distance, but Ellie with warmth that made her heart skip. "You're taking quite a risk," Mrs. Henderson commented one morning, as Ellie prepared for the day's regular classes. "These evening walks of yours have people talking." "People in this town talk about everything," Ellie replied, hoping her voice carried more confidence than she felt. "True enough, but they're talking about you spending time with certain unsavory elements." Ellie's hands stilled on her teaching materials. "What do you mean?" "Don't play innocent with me, dear. Half the town's seen you walking toward Marlowe's property after dark. The other half thinks you're meeting someone else entirely, which might actually be worse for your reputation." The casual revelation that their secret wasn't as secret as they'd believed hit Ellie like a physical blow. If Mrs. Henderson knew, how many others had noticed? How long before someone decided to investigate more thoroughly? "I can't control what people think," Ellie said carefully. "I'm guilty of nothing more than taking evening walks." "I hope that's true," Mrs. Henderson said with genuine concern, "because if it's not, you're risking everything you've built here. Your position, your reputation, your future, all of it could be destroyed by association with that man." That evening, Ellie arrived at the stable with a heavy heart and difficult news to share. As soon as the children were settled with their reading assignments, she pulled Clint aside. "We've been noticed," she said quietly. "People are talking about my evening walks, making connections they shouldn't make." Clint's face went carefully blank, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that could end this arrangement very quickly if we're not careful." For a long moment, they stood in the amber circle of lamplight, the weight of consequences settling between them like a challenge neither had expected to face so soon. "Maybe it's time to stop," Clint said finally, "before you lose everything for something that was never meant to last." "No," Ellie said with fierce conviction, "I won't abandon them, or you." The last two words escaped before she could stop them, revealing more than she'd intended. Clint's eyes widened slightly, and she saw her own feelings reflected back at Hertha, recognition that somewhere in their shared mission, they'd found something worth fighting for that went beyond the children's education. "Ellie," he said softly, and her name on his lips sounded like both a prayer and a warning. Behind them, Tommy called out with a question about his arithmetic, breaking the spell of the moment. But as they returned to their students, both carried the knowledge that their partnership had become something the town would find even more scandalous than their secret school. They were falling in love, and in Ash Ridge, that might be the most dangerous lesson of all. The faded photograph fell from between the pages of Clint's arithmetic book like a pressed flower, fluttering to the stable floor where Ellie had been arranging the evening's materials. She bent to retrieve it automatically, intending to hand it back without looking, but the images captured in sepia tones stopped her breath entirely. A younger Clint Marlowe stared back at her, his face unmarked by the scar that now defined his appearance to the people of Ash Ridge. Beside him stood a woman with kind eyes and dark hair, arranged in the fashion of several years past. Between them, a little girl of perhaps 5 years old smiled with the unconscious joy of childhood, her small hand clasped in Clint's larger one. The family portrait spoke of happiness, of love, of a life that seemed utterly at odds with the solitary existence Clint now lived. Ellie found herself staring at the image, trying to reconcile this glimpse of a different past with the man she thought she knew. "You shouldn't have seen that." Clint's voice came from directly behind her, quiet and strained. She turned to find him standing in the stable entrance, his face carefully blank, but his eyes reflecting something that looked like old pain made fresh. "I'm sorry," Ellie said, offering the photograph with hands that trembled slightly. "It fell out of your book. I wasn't prying. It doesn't matter." He took the picture from her, his fingers careful with the worn edges. "Though I suppose you have questions now." Before Ellie could respond, the sound of approaching voices interrupted them. The children were arriving for their evening lesson, chattering among themselves as they made their way to the stable. With practiced efficiency, Clint tucked the photograph away while Ellie arranged her expression into something resembling normalcy. The lesson that followed was a study in distraction. While Tommy worked through arithmetic problems and Sarah helped Maria with vocabulary words, Ellie found her attention repeatedly drawn to Clint. She noticed details she'd missed before, the way his eyes sometimes grew distant during quiet moments, the careful way he spoke about family or future plans, the gentle sadness that seemed to underlie his interactions with the children. Who were the woman and child in the photograph? Where were they now? And what had happened to transform the happy man in that image into the isolated figure the town now feared? When the children finally departed into the night, each carrying books and assignments for the following session, Ellie and Clint found themselves alone with questions that demanded answers. "You don't owe me any explanations," Ellie said finally, breaking the tense silence that had settled between them. "Maybe not," Clint replied, settling onto one of the wooden crates that served as their makeshift furniture. "But you've risked your reputation and your future to help with something that could destroy you if discovered. You deserve to know who you're really working with." He was quiet for so long that Ellie began to think he'd changed his mind about sharing his story. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories too painful to examine closely. "Her name was Catherine. The little girl was Emma, my wife and daughter." The simple words hit Ellie like a physical blow. Wife and daughter past tense, spoken with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate around old wounds. "They died 3 years ago," Clint continued, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the stable walls. "Fever took them both within a week of each other. I was away on a cattle drive when it started. Didn't even know they were sick until I came home to find." He stopped, his jaw working as he struggled with emotions too raw for easy expression. Ellie wanted to offer comfort, to say something that might ease the pain she could see etched in every line of his face. But she recognized the kind of grief that couldn't be soothed with words, the type of loss that changed a person's fundamental understanding of the world. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I went a little crazy after that," Clint said, his voice growing rougher. "Sold the ranch, spent months drinking and drifting from town to town. Ended up in Ash Ridge about 2 years ago, figured it was as good a place as any to disappear." "The saloon fight," Ellie said, beginning to understand. Clint nodded grimly. "I was drunk, angry at the world, looking for any excuse to hit something. Found it when I saw Jake Peterson cornering a woman behind the saloon, trying to force himself on her despite her protests." The pieces of the story began falling into place with horrifying clarity. The woman in question had been a visitor to town, someone passing through who wouldn't stay to contradict whatever version of events emerged. The men Clint had fought were local residents, whose word carried weight against that of a grieving stranger. Peterson and his friends told everyone I'd started the fight for no reason. Clint continued. Said I was drunk and violent, dangerous to decent folk. By the time I sobered up enough to tell my side of the story, their version was already accepted truth. But surely someone saw what really happened, Ellie protested. Witnesses who could corroborate your account. A few people saw, Clint admitted. But Peterson's family has money and influence in this town. Nobody wanted to cross them by supporting a drifter's claims. Easier to let me be the villain and move on with their lives. The injustice of it made Ellie's chest tight with anger. A man, grieving the loss of his family, had tried to protect another woman from assault, only to find himself branded as the aggressor by people who preferred convenient lies to complicated truths. Why didn't you leave, she asked. Find somewhere else to start over? Clint was quiet for a moment, his scarred hands turning his hat over and over in his lap. At first, I was too broken to care where I was or what people thought of me. By the time I started healing enough to think clearly, I'd found the children. Tommy and the others. Tommy first, sleeping in doorways and scraping by on odd jobs nobody else wanted. Then Sarah, running from something back east that still gives her nightmares. Ben, whose mother works herself to exhaustion just to keep them both fed. His voice grew softer, filled with the paternal affection Ellie had witnessed during their teaching sessions. They needed someone to see their potential, to believe they could become more than what this town expected from kids like them. So, you stayed. I stayed, started teaching them what I could, using books I'd kept from better days. Figured if I couldn't save my own daughter, maybe I could help save someone else's children. The photograph suddenly made perfect sense, just as a memento of happiness lost, but as a reminder of why the work they were doing mattered so deeply to him. Every evening spent teaching, reading, and arithmetic was both an act of love and a form of redemption, a way to honor the memory of a little girl who would never grow up to need such lessons herself. The woman you helped that night, Ellie said carefully. Do you know what happened to her? She left town the next morning on the first stage out, Clint replied. Smart choice considering. Never saw her again. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of his revelations settling between them like stones in still water. Everything Ellie thought she knew about Ash Ridge's cruel cowboy had been turned upside down, replaced by the truth of a grieving father who'd tried to do the right thing and been punished for it. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. It explains so much about who you really are. Does it change anything? Clint asked, and she heard vulnerability beneath the casual tone. Knowing that I'm not just the town outcast, but a widower who couldn't even protect his own family. The question revealed fears that went deeper than public reputation doubts about his worth as a man, as a protector, as someone deserving of affection or respect. Ellie's heart ached for the pain he'd carried alone for so long. It changes everything, she said softly, but not in the way you think. She moved closer, close enough to see the surprise in his eyes as she reached out to touch his scarred cheek, the mark left by Peterson's ring during that long-ago fight. It makes me understand that you're not the cruel cowboy at all, she continued. You're a good man who's been grieving and blamed for things beyond his control. And what you've built with these children, it's beautiful, Clint. Catherine and Emma would be proud of who you've become. For a moment, she thought he might pull away from her touch, retreat behind the walls he'd built to protect himself from further pain. Instead, he leaned into her palm, his eyes closing, as if her words had been both blessing and absolution. I never thought I'd care about anyone again, he admitted quietly. Never thought I deserved to. You deserve every happiness, Ellie said with fierce conviction, and these children are lucky to have you in their lives. So am I. When he opened his eyes and looked at her, she saw not the feared outcast of Ash Ridge, but a man capable of great love who'd been convinced he was unworthy of receiving it in return. The truth of his story had indeed changed. Everything it had revealed that her growing feelings for him were not misplaced affection for a dangerous man, but recognition of a kindred spirit who understood both loss and the power of hope. In the lamplight of their makeshift classroom, surrounded by the tools of education and the echoes of children's laughter. They found themselves balanced on the edge of something that could either save them both or destroy whatever peace they'd managed to build in the shadows of a judgmental town. The anonymous letter arrived at Sheriff Watson's office on a cold November morning, delivered by someone who'd slipped it under his door during the night. The handwriting was deliberately disguised, the words chosen with malicious precision. Sheriff Watson, it is my Christian duty to inform you of immoral activities taking place under cover of darkness at the old livery stable. The disgraced Clint Marlowe has been meeting with our schoolteacher, Miss Gray, for purposes that no decent person would approve. Children are being corrupted by their association. This ungodly behavior must be stopped before it spreads further poison through our community. A concerned citizen. Watson read the letter 3 times, his weathered face growing more troubled with each reading. The accusations were vague enough to avoid specifics, while inflammatory enough to demand investigation. Whoever had written it understood exactly how to manipulate the fears and prejudices of a frontier town. By mid-morning, word of the letter had somehow spread through Ash Ridge like wildfire through dry grass. Mrs. Henderson mentioned it over breakfast, her voice heavy with concern for Ellie's reputation. Mr. Carver discussed it with customers at the general store, each retelling, adding new embellishments to the basic accusations. Even Reverend Mills found occasion to reference it during his Thursday morning Bible study, though he couched his comments in terms of prayer for those who might have lost their way. Ellie first learned of the letter when Marcus Morrison approached her desk after the day's lessons had ended. Miss Gray? The boy's voice carried the careful tone children use when discussing adult troubles they don't fully understand. My father wanted me to ask if you're feeling well. He says people are worried about you. The innocent question sent ice through Ellie's veins. I'm fine, Marcus. Why would people be worried? I don't know exactly. Something about you spending time with bad men. Marcus shrugged with the casual indifference of youth. Father says maybe you need protecting from yourself. After Marcus left, Ellie sat alone in her empty classroom, staring at the slate board where she'd written the day's arithmetic problems. The carefully ordered world she'd built in Ash Ridge was crumbling around her, and she hadn't even seen the attack coming. That evening, she made her way to the stable with growing dread, half expecting to find it empty or surrounded by townspeople demanding explanations. Instead, she found Clint waiting alone in the lamplight, his face grim with knowledge of their changed circumstances. The children won't be coming tonight, he said without preamble. I sent word for them to stay away until this settles. You heard about the letter. Hard not to hear about it. Half the town's discussing whether to form a committee to investigate your moral character. His voice carried bitter resignation. I told you this would happen eventually. Ellie set down her bag of teaching materials with hands that shook slightly. What exactly are people saying? The worst possible interpretation of everything we've been doing. Secret meetings between the fallen woman and the dangerous outcast. Children being exposed to corrupting influences. Clint's jaw tightened with suppressed anger. They're turning something beautiful into something ugly because it's easier than admitting they might have been wrong about either of us. What do? We end this before it destroys you completely. Clint began gathering the children's books, stacking them with careful precision. I'll take responsibility for everything. Tell them I forced you to help, threatened you somehow. Your reputation might survive if people believe you were coerced. Absolutely not, Ellie said with fierce conviction. I won't let you sacrifice yourself to protect me. What's the alternative? Let them destroy both of us. Clint's voice rose with frustration. You have a life here, Ellie. A respectable position, a future. I'm already ruined. There's nothing left for them to take from me. There's everything left to take, she countered. Your self-respect, your relationship with the children, any chance at happiness. I won't be the reason you lose those things. They stared at each other across the makeshift classroom. Two people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances now facing its potential destruction. The books and supplies that had seemed so important moments before lay forgotten as the weight of their situation settled between them. There might be another way, Ellie said slowly, an idea forming as she spoke. What if we tell the truth? All of it? Clint shook his head immediately. They won't believe the truth. They've already decided what kind of people we are. Some won't believe it, Ellie agreed, but others might. The parents who've seen changes in Tommy, Sarah, Ben, Maria, people who've noticed that the children are reading better, asking smarter questions, showing hope for their futures. It's too dangerous. If we're wrong, we're no worse off than we are now. Ellie interrupted. But if we're right, if even a few people listen to what we've actually been doing, we might save not just ourselves but the school as well. Clint was quiet for a long moment, his scarred hands still mechanically stacking books, while his mind worked through possibilities and probabilities. When he finally looked up, his expression carried the weight of a man who'd learned not to hope for miracles. You're talking about standing up in front of the whole town and admitting to everything we've done, defending something they're already convinced is wrong. I'm talking about telling them about Tommy's mathematical gifts, Sarah's poetry, Ben's scientific curiosity, Maria's determination to learn English. I'm talking about showing them what we've actually accomplished, instead of letting them imagine the worst. And if they still condemn us, Ellie met his gaze steadily, then at least we'll go down fighting for something worthwhile instead of slinking away in shame. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation, both tensed, expecting the worst, until Tommy's familiar voice called softly from outside the stable. Mr. Marlowe, Miss Gray, are you in there? Tommy, Clint called back, relief evident in his voice. I told you to stay away tonight. The boy appeared in the doorway, followed by Sarah, Ben, and Maria. All four children looked frightened, but determined, clutching their books like protective talismans. We heard what people are saying, Sarah announced, her young voice steady despite her obvious fear. About you two doing bad things. We know it's not true, Tommy added fiercely. You've been teaching us, helping us learn things. Nobody else cared if we knew. But people won't listen to kids, Ben said sadly. They think we don't understand what's really happening. We want to help, Maria said in careful English, her accent still thick, but her meaning clear. You help us, now we help you. Ellie felt tears prick her eyes at their loyalty, their willingness to risk what little security they had to defend the people who'd given them hope. These children understood better than most adults what they stood to lose if the evening school was destroyed. It's too dangerous for you to be involved, Clint said gently. This is adult trouble. No, Sarah said with startling firmness. This is our trouble too. If they make you stop teaching us, where does that leave us? Back where we started, with nothing. She's right, Tommy said, his young face set with determination. We're the proof that what you've been doing is good. Maybe if people see how much we've learned, they'll understand. Ellie looked at Clint and saw her own thoughts reflected in his expression. The children were offering to stand with them, to risk whatever consequences might come from publicly supporting their discredited teachers. It was both heartbreaking and inspiring a testament to the bonds that had formed in their unlikely classroom. If we do this, Clint said slowly, there's no going back. Once we make this public, everyone will know about the school, about what we've been doing. They already know something, Ellie pointed out. The question is whether we let them define what that something is, or whether we show them the truth ourselves. The children waited in the lamplight while their teachers made a decision that would affect all their lives. Outside, the November wind rattled the stable walls, carrying the promise of winter and change. Finally, Clint nodded. We tell them everything. Let them see what we've built instead of what they imagine we've done. When? Ellie asked. Sunday after church services, when the whole town's gathered and there's no avoiding the conversation. Clint's expression was grim but determined. We ask for a town meeting and lay out the facts. What if they won't listen? Then we'll know we tried, Tommy said with wisdom beyond his years, and we'll face whatever comes next together. As they made plans for what might be their final stand, Ellie found herself thinking about courage and truth, about the price of doing what's right in a world that often prefers comfortable lies. They were about to risk everything for the chance to protect something precious, not just their love for each other, but their commitment to children who deserved better than society's cast-offs. It was a gamble with impossible odds, but it was also the only choice they could live with. The next few days would determine whether Ash Ridge was ready to see past its prejudices or whether some truths were too challenging for a small town to accept. The church was fuller than it had been since Easter Sunday, packed with townspeople who'd come as much for the promised confrontation as for Reverend Mill's sermon on moral rectitude. Word had spread through Ash Ridge like a summer grass fire. There would be a town meeting after services to address the situation involving their schoolteacher and the notorious Clint Marlowe. Ellie sat in her usual pew near the front, acutely aware of the whispered conversations and sideways glances that followed her every movement. The respectful nods and morning greetings she'd grown accustomed to had been replaced by suspicious stares and pointed silences. In the span of 3 days, she'd gone from being the town's educated lady to its suspected fallen woman. Behind her, she could hear fragments of hushed conversations, meeting with him after dark. Those poor children being exposed to. Always knew there was something strange about her. The Reverend's sermon seemed specifically crafted to address the current scandal without mentioning names directly. He spoke at length about the dangers of moral corruption, the importance of protecting innocent minds from contaminating influences, and the duty of righteous citizens to stand against behavior that threatened community values. "We must be ever vigilant," Mills intoned from his pulpit, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "against those who would use positions of trust to spread corruption among the most vulnerable members of our flock." When the service finally ended, nobody moved to leave. Instead, the congregation rearranged itself for the town meeting, with chairs scraping against wooden floors and voices rising in anticipation. Ellie remained seated as the crowd settled around her, feeling like a defendant awaiting trial. Sheriff Watson stepped forward to moderate the proceedings, his weathered face grave with the weight of his responsibilities. "Folks, we're here to address concerns that have been raised about activities involving Miss Gray and Clint Marlowe. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that we're here to seek truth, not to satisfy curiosity or spread gossip." Councilman Webb rose from his front row seat, his considerable bulk making the movement laboriously dramatic. "Sheriff, with all due respect, this isn't about gossip. This is about protecting our children from corrupting influences and maintaining moral standards in our community." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Ellie could see the Peterson family in the third row, Jake Peterson's face still bearing faint scars from his long-ago encounter with Clint. His presence reminded everyone of the violence they associated with the man they were there to condemn. "I call on Miss Gray to explain herself," Webb continued, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "What exactly has she been doing with that man, and why has she been meeting him in secret?" All eyes turned to Ellie as she rose slowly from her pew. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I've been helping Mr. Marlowe teach children to read." The simple statement hit the crowd like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of confusion and disbelief through the assembled townspeople. "Teach children?" Mrs. Henderson's voice carried clear surprise. "What children?" "Children who have no other opportunity for education," Ellie replied, turning to address the crowd directly. "Tommy Briggs, who's been living on the streets since his parents died. Sarah Whitman, who's been surviving on her own after running from troubles back east. Ben Crawford, whose mother works too hard to afford proper schooling. Maria Santos, whose family speaks Spanish and needed help learning English." "That's preposterous," Councilman Webb sputtered. "Marlowe teaching children? The man's a violent drunk with no business around decent folk, let alone impressionable young minds. Have you ever spoken to Mr. Marlowe about his intentions with these children?" Ellie asked, her teacher's instincts taking over. "Have you asked what they've been learning, or seen evidence of the progress they've made?" "I don't need to speak to him," Webb replied hotly. His reputation speaks for itself. Does it? The question came from the back of the church, where Clint Marlowe stood in the doorway. A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd as he stepped inside, removing his hat with quiet dignity. He wore his best clothes, a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and a vest that spoke of better days, but it was his demeanor that surprised most of the assembled townspeople. There was no swagger, no threat, no sign of the dangerous character they'd constructed in their imaginations. "I asked Miss Gray to let me speak for myself," Clint said, his voice carrying clearly through the church, "since it's my actions that brought this trouble to her door." Sheriff Watson gestured for him to approach the front. "The floor is yours, Marlowe." As Clint walked down the center aisle, Ellie could see the crowd's reaction. Some faces showed fear, others curiosity, but most displayed the kind of wary attention people give to something that doesn't match their expectations. 3 years ago, Clint began, standing near the pulpit where the Reverend had delivered his sermon on moral corruption, I lost my wife and daughter to fever. It broke something in me, left me angry at the world and looking for ways to numb the pain. His voice was steady, but Ellie could hear the effort it cost him to speak about his loss in front of people who'd already judged him irredeemable. I came to Ash Ridge looking for a place to disappear, and I found children who needed help. Tommy Briggs, sleeping in doorways and working for pennies. Ben Crawford, whose mother couldn't afford to send him to school. Sarah Whitman, a girl with no safe place to go. He paused, his gaze moving across the crowd with quiet dignity. I started teaching them because I remembered what it felt like to have someone believe you could be more than your circumstances. My own daughter will never have the chance to learn her letters, but maybe I could help someone else's children find hope in education. You expect us to believe, Jake Peterson called out from his seat, that you've been meeting with these children out of the goodness of your heart, a man who nearly killed 3 people in a drunken rage. Clint's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. I expect you to look at the evidence of what we've accomplished, not the stories you've told yourselves about who I am. What evidence? Councilman Webb demanded. Tommy, Clint called toward the back of the church. Would you come forward, please? The crowd turned as Tommy Briggs walked down the center aisle, his thin frame dressed in clothes that had been carefully cleaned for the occasion. The boy's face was pale but determined as he took his place beside Clint. Tommy, Clint said gently, would you show these folks what you've learned? The boy nodded and pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. In a clear voice that carried to every corner of the church, he began to read, Education is the pathway from darkness to light, from ignorance to knowledge, from despair to hope. Every child deserves the chance to learn, to grow, and to dream of a better future. The words hung in the air like a challenge to every assumption the townspeople had made about the boy they'd dismissed as worthless street trash. This wasn't the barely literate waif they'd expected, but a young scholar speaking with confidence and intelligence. Tommy, Ellie said, stepping forward to join them. Would you tell everyone about your mathematics studies? The boy's face lit up with pride. Mr. Marlowe taught me that numbers follow patterns, just like music or poetry. If you understand the patterns, you can solve problems that look impossible at first. He turned to face the crowd directly. Would anyone like to give me an arithmetic problem to solve? Dr. Morrison rose from his seat, his expression thoughtful. What's 17 times 24? Tommy considered for a moment, then smiled. 408. Would you like me to show my work? A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. This level of mathematical ability was impressive for any child, remarkable for one they'd assumed was barely educable. This proves nothing, Councilman Webb protested, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. One child reciting prepared lines. It's not prepared, Tommy interrupted with respectful firmness. Mr. Marlowe and Miss Gray taught me to think, not just memorize. They showed me that learning is about understanding, not just repeating what someone else tells you. The boy's defense of his teachers was more powerful than any argument the adults might have made. Here was living proof that their secret school had accomplished something remarkable, taking a child society had written off and nurturing him into a confident young scholar. As Tommy's words settled over the crowd, Dr. Morrison stood slowly from his seat. The town's physician commanded respect even from those who disagreed with him, and his opinion carried weight in matters requiring careful judgment. "I'd like to say something," Morrison announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of confused conversations. "About the night Clint Marlowe fought Jake Peterson and his friends." A hush fell over the church. This was the incident that had defined Marlowe's reputation in Ash Ridge, the violence that had branded him as dangerous and unwelcome. Jake Peterson's face went pale, while his companions shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I was there that night," Morrison continued, his gaze moving across the crowd with deliberate precision. "Called to tend the injured after the fight was over. What I saw then, and what I've remained silent about since, weighs heavily on my conscience." Sheriff Watson leaned forward with interest. "Doc, are you saying there's more to the story than what's been told?" "I'm saying there's truth that's been buried under convenient lies." Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone who'd witnessed too much human suffering to tolerate injustice. Jake Peterson and his friends weren't the victims that night. They were the aggressors. Peterson jumped to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "That's a damned lie. Marlowe attacked us without provocation." "Sit down, Jake," Morrison commanded with quiet steel. "You've had 3 years to maintain your version of events. Now it's time for the truth." The doctor turned to address the full congregation. "I arrived at the scene to find a Womana traveling lady who'd stopped in town for the night cowering behind the saloon in torn clothing. She was terrified, shaking, barely coherent. When I examined her, I found evidence of attempted assault." A collective gasp swept through the church. This was not the story they'd been told, not the narrative that had shaped their understanding of that violent night. "The woman told me what happened," Morrison continued relentlessly. "Peterson and 2 of his friends had cornered her, demanding favors she wasn't willing to provide. When she tried to leave, they became violent. Marlowe happened upon the scene and intervened." "Why didn't you speak up before?" Sheriff Watson demanded, his voice tight with the implications of what he was hearing. "Because the woman begged me not to involve her in any legal proceedings. She was already ruined by what had happened. Having her name attached to a public trial would have destroyed her completely. And because," Morrison's voice grew heavy with regret, "I was a coward who let community pressure silence me when I should have stood for what was right." Ellie watched the faces around her transform as the true story emerged. Confusion, shock, and dawning realization replaced the certainty that had sustained their condemnation of Clint. Some people, particularly the women, looked horrified at the thought of what might have happened if he hadn't intervened. "You're lying," Peterson snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "Trying to protect your friend by spreading lies about decent men." "Am I?" Morrison reached into his vest and withdrew a folded paper. "I kept the woman's written statement, along with my medical observations from that night. I told myself I was preserving evidence in case it was needed, but the truth is I was preserving my own conscience." He handed the document to Sheriff Watson, who read it with growing gravity. The sheriff's expression darkened as he absorbed the details of what had really occurred behind the saloon 3 years earlier. "This changes everything," Watson said quietly. "If this account is accurate, Marlowe was acting in defense of an innocent woman, not starting a fight for amusement." "It's all lies," Peterson shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "Marlowe's got you all fooled." "Enough." The voice that silenced Peterson came from an unexpected source. Reverend Mills, who had remained quiet during the proceedings. The minister's face was grave as he stepped forward to address the congregation. "I, too, have something to confess," Mills said, his voice heavy with shame. "I was present that night, walking home from visiting a sick parishioner. I saw the altercation begin, saw Peterson and his companions cornering the woman. I saw Mr. Marlowe attempt to intervene peacefully before violence became necessary. The revelation from their spiritual leader hit the crowd like a physical blow. If the Reverend had witnessed Peterson's guilt, why had he allowed an innocent man to be condemned? I was a coward," Mills continued, his voice breaking slightly. I feared the social consequences of contradicting prominent families in our community. I told myself that God would provide justice in his own time, but the truth is, I chose comfort over righteousness. The church fell silent except for the sound of Peterson and his friends quietly slipping toward the exit. Their departure went largely unnoticed as the crowd grappled with the complete reversal of everything they'd believed about that night. Clint stood amid the revelations with the quiet dignity of a man who'd endured years of unjust condemnation without bitterness. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no triumph, only weary relief. "I never asked for vindication," he said simply. "I only wanted to help children who had nowhere else to turn. If my reputation made that impossible, I was willing to bear that cost." "But it shouldn't have been necessary," Ellie said, stepping closer to him. "A good man shouldn't have to hide his kindness because other people were too cowardly to tell the truth." Tommy moved to stand beside them, followed by Sarah, Ben, and Maria. The children formed a protective circle around their teachers, their young faces serious with understanding of what was at stake. "Mr. Marlowe saved my life," Sarah said suddenly, her voice clear and strong. "Not just by teaching me to read, but by showing me that some adults can be trusted, that some people keep their promises. He taught me that being poor doesn't mean being stupid," Ben added, "that I can learn about animals and maybe become a veterinarian someday, even if my mother takes in washing." "He helped me learn English," Maria said in careful but confident words. "Now I can help my family talk to other people, make better life." The testimonies of the children, combined with the revelations about Peterson's true character, created a complete picture that no honest person could ignore. The cruel cowboy was revealed as a protective father figure, the dangerous outcast as a dedicated teacher. Sheriff Watson rose from his seat, his expression grim with the weight of justice, too long delayed. "I have some arrests to make," he announced. "Peterson, Mitchell, and Barnesville coming with me to answer questions about events from 3 years ago." As the 3 men were led away in custody, the remainder of the congregation began to disperse, their conversations subdued and thoughtful. The comfortable certainties that had governed their understanding of right and wrong had been shattered, replaced by uncomfortable questions about their own capacity for judgment and justice. "Doctor," Morrison approached Clint with an extended hand. "I owe you an apology that's 3 years overdue," he said simply, "and my gratitude for preventing something terrible from happening." "Apology accepted," Clint replied, shaking the doctor's hand. "What matters now is what we do going forward." "Indeed," Morrison agreed. "And I believe what you and Miss Gray have been doing with these children is exactly what this town needs. Education, compassion, second chances virtues we should be celebrating, not condemning." As the church emptied, Ellie found herself standing with Clint and the children in a space that had witnessed both their condemnation and their vindication. The morning had transformed them from pariahs into heroes, though the change felt surreal after months of secrecy and fear. "What happens now?" Tommy asked, his young face hopeful but uncertain. "Now," Ellie said, looking at Clint with love and admiration, "we build a proper school, one where every child who wants to learn is welcome, regardless of their circumstances." The vote, when it came later that afternoon, was overwhelmingly in favor of establishing an official evening school for working children, with Clint Marlowe and Ellie Gray as its appointed teachers. Truth, it seemed, had finally prevailed over prejudice in the town of Ash Ridge. 6 months later, the brass bell mounted beside the door of Ash Ridge's official evening school rang out across the prairie, calling working children to their lessons as the sun settled low over the Montana grassland. The bell had been donated by the town council as both an apology and a symbol of their commitment to education for all children, regardless of their families' circumstances. Ellie stood in the doorway of what had once been the old livery stable, now transformed into a proper classroom with real desks, a blackboard, oil lamps for adequate lighting, and shelves lined with books donated by families throughout the county. The space bore little resemblance to the makeshift school where their journey had begun, yet it retained the warmth and sense of sanctuary that had made it special from the beginning. "Miss Gray, Mrs. Marlowe," Tommy called from his desk near the front of the room, his grin wide with the joy of a boy who'd found his place in the world. At 13, he'd grown several inches and filled out considerably, his mathematical abilities earning him recognition from the Territorial Education Board. "Are you ready for tonight's presentation?" Ellie touched the simple gold band on her finger, still marveling at how naturally it felt to be called by her married name. The wedding had taken place on a crisp January morning, with the children serving as witnesses and half the town in attendance, a celebration that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. "I'm ready if you are," she replied, watching as Tommy arranged his papers with the careful precision of a born scholar. Tonight, he would present his research on innovative farming techniques to a gathering that included several prominent ranchers interested in hearing his ideas. The boy who'd once swept saloon floors for pennies was now consulted on matters of agricultural science. Sarah Whitman entered the classroom carrying an armload of books, her confidence a stark contrast to the frightened runaway who'd first appeared in their secret stable school. At 15, she'd become Ellie's unofficial assistant teacher, working with younger children while pursuing her own advanced studies. Her poetry had been published in the territorial newspaper, earning praise from readers across Montana. "The new students are here," Sarah announced, setting down her books. "Maria's bringing them in." Through the doorway came Maria Santos, now fluent in English and serving as translator for families throughout the region. Behind her walked 3 children whose circumstances reminded Ellie of those early days: a boy whose father worked the railroad, a girl whose mother took in sewing, and twins whose family had recently arrived from Ireland with nothing but hope and determination. Ben Crawford bounded in with his usual enthusiasm, his arms full of specimens he'd collected for the evening's natural science lesson. At 12, he'd already been accepted as an apprentice to Dr. Morrison, learning both veterinary and medical skills that would serve him well in a territory where such knowledge was precious and rare. "Look what I found," Ben announced, carefully unwrapping a preserved butterfly. "It's a species I've never seen before. I wrote to the university in Bozeman about it." The transformation in all the children was remarkable, but it was the change in the town itself that truly amazed Ellie. What had begun as a secret rebellion against societal limitations had evolved into a community commitment to education and opportunity. The evening school served nearly 30 children now, with a waiting list of families hoping for admission. Clint entered the classroom with his own armload of supplies, pausing to help one of the newer students arrange her materials. The man who'd once been feared and avoided was now sought out for advice on everything from horse training to conflict resolution. His reputation had been completely rehabilitated, replaced by respect for his wisdom, patience, and unwavering commitment to helping others. "Everyone settled?" he asked, his eyes meeting Ellie's across the room, with the warmth that still made her heart skip. Their partnership had deepened beyond the professional into something profoundly personal, built on shared purpose and mutual respect. As the children began their lessons, Ellie found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The anonymous letter that had threatened to destroy everything they'd built had instead become the catalyst for transformation, not just of their own lives, but of an entire community's understanding of justice, education, and the power of second chances. The new school bell, inscribed with the words, "Education conquers all," rang out again as late. Arriving students hurried to join their classmates. The sound carried across the town, a reminder to everyone within hearing that knowledge and opportunity were no longer privileges reserved for the wealthy, but rights extended to all children willing to work for them. "Mrs. Marlowe?" Maria approached Ellie's desk with a question about her English grammar assignment. "I want to make sure I understand this correctly." As Ellie helped the young woman pass through complex sentence structures, she marveled at how far they'd all traveled from that first night, when she'd discovered Clint teaching 3 forgotten children in an abandoned stable. The cruel cowboy had become a beloved teacher, and respected member of the community. The lonely schoolteacher from Boston had found both love and purpose in the unlikeliest of places. Most importantly, children who'd once been written off as worthless were now preparing for futures limited only by their own dreams and determination. Tommy stood to present his agricultural research, his voice clear and confident as he explained irrigation techniques to an audience that included some of the most successful ranchers in the territory. Sarah read one of her poems about frontier life, her words painting pictures that made even hardened cowboys nod with recognition and respect. Ben demonstrated his knowledge of animal anatomy while discussing his plans to establish a veterinary practice that would serve the entire region. As the evening progressed, Ellie watched Clint move among the students with the same gentle patience he'd shown from the beginning. He caught her eye and smiled the expression, transforming his scarred face into something beautiful and kind. The photograph he'd once hidden away now sat prominently on their mantelpiece at home, a reminder that love endures beyond loss and that purpose can be found even in the deepest grief. When the last student had departed into the night, carrying books and assignments and dreams that seemed suddenly achievable, Ellie and Clint stood together in their classroom. The oil lamps cast warm shadows across walls, lined with student artwork and achievement certificates, testament to the power of believing in potential others couldn't see. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't followed Tommy that night?" Clint asked, his arms settling around her waist with familiar comfort. "I try not to think about it," Ellie replied, leaning into his strength. "But I know we were meant to find each other, to build this together." Outside, the Montana wind carried the sounds of a town settling into peaceful night, children safely home from their lessons. Families gathered around dinner tables where conversations now included discussions of books and ideas and possibilities that seemed limitless under the vast prairie sky. The cruel cowboy and the lonely teacher had become something far more precious, a family bound together not just by love, but by their shared commitment to nurturing hope in places where others saw only hardship. Their makeshift classroom had evolved into a beacon of opportunity, proof that sometimes the roughest hands do indeed hold the gentlest truths, and that love truly grows best where no one thought to plant it. As they extinguished the lamps and locked the door behind them, the brass bell caught the last rays of sunlight, gleaming like a promise that tomorrow would bring new chances to learn, to grow, and to discover that education, like love, has the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities willing to open their hearts to change. In the end, Ash Ridge had learned the most important lesson of all, that second chances, offered with courage and accepted with grace, can create miracles that echo through generations. And sometimes, the very people a town tries hardest to avoid are exactly the ones it needs most to show the way toward a better future.